Okay, welcome back. Today we're doing October-November 2021 question paper 13. Question 3, no longer relevant to syllabus, so we'll ignore and we'll start at question 30. Okay, question 30, very simple. Components of AD. So remember, components of AD are C plus I plus G plus X minus M, which is consumer expenditure, consumption, investment, government spending, plus net exports, X being exports and M being imports. So therefore, very simply, that matches up with A. B, C and D are just simply wrong. They are not the components of AD. Question 29. What policy would be likely to increase inflation? So increase in income tax would move AD to the left. It is a contractionary fiscal policy. It will therefore have less disposable income for consumers, so the consumption element here and the investment element will drop. Increase in interest rates will have the same effect. It will make borrowing harder. It's a contractionary monetary policy. AD will move to the left. Limiting the amount banks can lend is similarly a contractionary monetary policy. Credit regulations is what we call that. AD would move left because we would have less consumption and less investment from it becoming more difficult to lend. Raising the level of import tariffs, however, would cause inflation. It would cause cost push inflation, possibly, which is where AS would move to the left. And the reason for that is raising the level of import tariffs will increase the price of raw materials for domestic firms. That will increase their cost of production. And when their cost of production increases, then in the domestic economy, goods become more expensive, which means that aggregate supply would shift to the left. What's an example of the use of monetary policy? So we just explained this. Reducing corporation tax is fiscal policy. Maximum price controls is a microeconomic concept, not a macroeconomic concept. Switching from direct taxation to indirect taxation is fiscal policy, not monetary policy. And reducing interest rates, that is a expansionary monetary policy designed to move AD to the right, designed to make it easier for people to borrow, which will increase consumption and increase investment. Question 27. Diagram shows current account of Belgium's balance of payments from 2016 to 2017. So we can see here what they've moved from 2016 is from a deficit into a surplus. So we can assume that their exports have risen and their imports have either dropped or remained the same. And again, it comes back to the components of AD. It will not result in a fall in economic growth. It should result in an increase in economic growth. And that is because it will result in AD moving to the right. Increase in net exports. Fall in foreign currency reserves, it has nothing to do with that. That's to do with the exchange rate. If they operate on, for example, a fixed exchange rate. Fall in the number of unemployed, that's correct, because AD moves to the right, real GDP increases, employment levels will increase, national income will increase, living standards will all increase corresponding to that too. And fall in the rate of inflation. Again, AD moves to the right. It's likely to increase the rate of demand pull inflation, not decrease the rate of inflation. Okay, very simply, same import tariff diagram. All we have to do is interpret the diagram, which is really simple. So here we have without the tariff, and then here we have with the tariff. This represents the supply on the domestic market, and demand represents the demand on the domestic market. So all we have to do is follow what happens when we impose the tariff. So we can see for the supply here, the supply will extend along the domestic supply curve and the demand will contract along the domestic demand curve. So therefore the demand will fall and the domestic supply will rise. Okay, question 25. A country has a floating exchange rate. An increase in which variable will cause its exchange rate to appreciate? Okay, so remember the thing that affects the variable that affects the floating exchange rates is the interest rates. Price level has nothing to do with it, income levels has nothing to do with it, and either does employment levels. But if we have an increase in the interest rates, what that will do is it will increase the demand for the currency. On the floating exchange rate system, demand will shift to the right, and when demand shifts to the right, you draw a simple demand and supply diagram. You can see that the price will rise, and that will cause an appreciation in the value of the currency. Question 24. Country X places a tariff of 20% on steel products imported from country Y. Country Y retaliates with a 20% tariff on computers imported from country X. What is a certain economic consequence of these actions? Okay. Balance of payments remain unchanged. That is not certain. That depends on the PED, right? Because it depends on the extent to which our exports are now affected by a 20% tariff. And it depends on the demand for the imports that we're now importing at 20% higher price. So again, that will affect it as in terms of if the PED values are the same, then sure, it might remain unchanged because we might have a, in that case, a decrease in our imports. We might have a decrease in our exports as well, so it could also go down. Or it could even rise depending on whether the PED for exports and imports are elastic or inelastic. But to say they'll remain unchanged, that's making the assumption that the PED values will counteract each other and that export revenue and import expenditure will remain the same. Exchange rate value in which trade between the countries is based will be maintained. So again, that's not true because that again refers back to the PED and it refers to the demand and the supply for the currency, which will be based on the imports and the exports that we are either exports we are providing out or imports that we are bringing in. Profits and employment of domestic firms in both countries will be preserved. Again, that can't be assumed because protectionism, the import tariffs, we place a 20% tariff on imports, they place a 20% tariff on our exports. So we can assume that between the two countries, the volume of trade will be reduced. Our exports now become more expensive. Their imports for us now become more expensive. So we should import less from them and they should import less from us, which will mean that the volume of trade between the two countries should be reduced. Diagram shows AD and AS for an economy. We've got a shift to the right in AS. What would cause this? Okay, decrease in exchange rate, remember, can cause cost push inflation, which is AS to the left, from the increase in the price of raw materials, and it can also cause demand pull inflation from AD moving to the right. Does not result in AS moving to the left. Causes the demand pull inflation from our net exports increasing. Decrease in price level is not the cause of a shift, it's a consequence of the shift. Fall in immigration would result in aggregate supply moving left, possibly, as we have less labour force available, similar to the effect of net emigration. We have less workers available, we can produce less. Fall in the average levels of wages, that would result in AS moving to the right, because remember what it would do is it would lower our cost of production, and when our cost of production is lowered, that allows us to produce more products at a lower price. Question 22. A government decides to increase a quota on an imported good. What is likely to happen? So remember, if we're increasing a quota, let's say that the quota previously was 20. So the quota after is 30. What we're doing is we're actually allowing to have more imports come into the country when we're increasing a quota. Before we could only import 20 goods, now we can import 30 goods. So therefore, goods have become more expensive. Quotas are just limits, remember. They're not actually impacting the price, they're not a tariff, so they don't generate government revenue. The demand for the good will fall is not true, and then there will be more of the good imported. That directly correlates with what we've just shown here. Quota before and quota after, we will now import more of the goods than we did previously. Okay, terms of trade question. Which combination of changes would result in an increase in terms of trade? So remember, increase in terms of trade is where the price of exports rise relative to the price of imports. Okay, so in this example, if we go through these here, export prices, we're not looking at volumes, right? So we can ignore volumes, it's only the prices with the terms of trade. Export prices up by 10%, import prices up by 12%. That will cause a fall in the terms of trade because import prices are rising relative to export prices. Same for C. Import prices are up by 6%, export are only up by 5%. Same for B, because export prices are falling by more than import prices. So again, that will cause a deterioration or a fall. Except for A, export prices go down by 10%, but import prices are going down by 15%. So the prices of the exports are still rising relative to the prices of the imports because the fall is less. Question 20. Demand for a country's exports is price elastic. Government introduces export subsidies. Okay, so remember, with a subsidy, what it's going to do is it's going to lower the price of the product. We're told that it's price elastic, so if it's elastic, what that will do therefore is lower price will equal greater percentage change in quantity demanded, which will equal total export revenue to go up or to rise. So therefore our balance of trade will increase as we've got more export revenue, but our terms of trade, however, will decrease because remember that is only affected by the price of the exports, and with the subsidies their price will be lower. So we just explained that in the previous question as well. Okay, question 19. According to the theory of comparative advantage, which is the theory of the lower opportunity cost, specializing on the basis of whichever good and services you can produce at a lower opportunity cost than other countries, what makes trade beneficial for two countries? Each good has different goods to sell and different tastes. That's nothing to do with the theory of comparative advantage. Each country has different opportunity costs of production, yes, and we know, just like we explained here, that they will specialize based on the ones that have the lower opportunity cost. Absolute advantage is a different theory from comparative advantage. Remember, absolute advantage is to do with whichever good we can produce a higher output of, and the price of goods has nothing to do with the theory of comparative advantage. It's purely the opportunity cost. Okay, government wishes to reduce the consumption of alcohol. Which policy will it use to achieve this aim by fixing the price? So first of all, it's not going to fix a maximum price because that will increase the demand, which we're not trying to do, right? So we're not trying to increase the demand, we're trying to reduce consumption. So we're trying to reduce the demand, right? Or decrease the demand. So therefore we will impose a minimum price, and in order for the minimum price to be effective, remember that the minimum price has to be placed above the current equilibrium. And therefore fix the minimum price above market price, which will result in a strong contraction in demand and therefore reduced consumption levels from where we would have been here at equilibrium. And we can see that here. This is where we would have consumed previously. This is where we will now be consuming, because we can only sell the products that are demanded, right? Diagram shows the effects of a subsidy in the market for wheat. What area shows total government spending? Okay, so remember, the area of total government spending is the total area of the subsidy. Okay, area of the subsidy is calculated by demand shifts to the right. So we take from our new equilibrium point up until we hit the original supply. We go straight across and we take this straight across too. And then this is our total area of the subsidy, which is split between the benefit for the consumer and the benefit for the producer. Benefit for the consumer here will be the reduction in the price. And the benefit for the producer will be the area of the subsidy that they get to hold, essentially. Just like additional profit for them. So that will be P4, P2, J, and I, which is D in this answer. Which payment is a transfer payment? So remember, transfer payment is non-productive means of payments. Payment of indirect taxes is not a transfer payment, it's a productive form of payment. Government pension payments are. Payments of salaries, productive form of payment, and payment between firms is a productive forms of payment as well. So remember, transfer payments are things like pensions, unemployment benefits, children's allowances, etc. They're essentially transferred from individuals who are paying tax to individuals who are doing something non-productive to receive that payment. Vulnerable members of society, like pensioners who have retired, or like people who are unemployed and will need certain levels of income to be able to sustain any kind of standard of living. Question 15. Why does the production of public goods have to be financed by government? Again, this paper I think was relatively easy. There's a lot of very similar questions from previous years. So one person's consumption of a good means it's not available for anybody else. That is not true. That would make it rivalrous, and we know that public goods are non-excludable and non-rivalrous. People are able to consume public goods without paying for them. That is true, and that is why we have to provide them. Because the private sector can't charge a price, they won't provide them themselves, which means that the government has to step in and provide those public goods. Cost of producing public goods is higher in private sector. That's not true. It's just about the fact they can't charge a price for it, and they'll charge a price significantly above the cost of public goods. Again, not true. They can't charge a price because they're non-excludable and they're non-rivalrous, and we've already explained that. Question 14. Government wishes to impose a tax on a good so that the consumer pays most of the tax increase. What type of elasticity? PES, PS, PS. Okay, so remember, there's a theory relating to this. First of all, if I just take D, if we have perfectly inelastic supply, I've explained this in a previous video before, can't remember exactly which one, but if we have perfectly inelastic supply, then the tax burden from an indirect tax will fall entirely on the producer. Okay, and that's because the quantity supplied cannot change. The more inelastic the PED, the greater the tax burden on the consumer. But the more inelastic the PES, the greater the tax burden on the producer. Okay, so therefore if we know that that theory applies, then the more inelastic the PES, the greater the burden falls on the producer. So if they want the consumer to pay most of the tax, we're going to be looking for the more elastic PES value. Okay, if you want to remember it like this, you can. More inelastic PED, greater the burden on consumer, therefore more elastic PED, the greater the burden on the producer. Perfectly inelastic, entirely 100% up to the producer, that the incidence or the burden of the indirect tax. Perfectly inelastic demand, 100% falls on the consumer as well. So they just have the opposite relationship essentially in terms of the burden. Like I said, I explained this with diagrams in a previous video before. If you want to put a comment in the comment section, I can direct you back to the video when I'm able to take a look after recording which video it was. Okay, XED. So remember, XED, if it's a plus, that means that they're substitutes. XED shows whether they're substitutes or complements. So if it's minus, that will tell us that they're complements. Therefore, S and P we can see are substitutes. For D, it's nothing to do with an inferior good. Inferior goods are calculated using YED, income elasticity of demand, not cross elasticity. And therefore, P and OR are complements, and we can see that here. P and OR is a negative figure, so they will have a complementary relationship. Okay, question 12. The table shows the market demand and market supply for kiwi fruit over a year. At a market price of $3 per kilogram, there's disequilibrium in the market. Which action would the government have to take to achieve market equilibrium? Okay, so we've got total market demand here and total market supply at a price of $3. Very simply, we need to move this supply to be 160 in order to match the demand so we can have equilibrium. Right? Remember, equilibrium is where demand equals supply. So therefore, what we're going to have to do is the price of kiwi fruit will essentially have to move here from 5 to 3, which means that we will have to provide a subsidy because we want to increase the supply, remember. So we're going to have to incentivize them to increase the supply by essentially allowing them to now receive, the producer that is, $5 per kiwi, which is $2 above what they are currently receiving for 3. So therefore we'll have to subsidize kiwi production by $2 per kilogram, and that will allow us to have an equilibrium, because now at $5 essentially for what they're receiving, they will supply 160,000 tons to the market, and that will equal our market demand at $3. Question 11. Diagram shows the demand for and supply of a normal good. What changes would result in a new equilibrium? Okay, so straight away, if we have a look here, we can see to result in a new equilibrium, we would have to have a rightward shift in the demand curve and a leftward shift in the supply curve. Okay, so a decrease in both demand for and supply of the good, that would be demand left, supply left, that would not result. Increase in demand and supply, again, that would not result. Demand would move right here, and then we'd move to a new equilibrium somewhere around here if supply shifted to the right. Increase in consumer incomes would shift demand right. Decrease in supply of good would shift supply left, so that would be correct. Increase in price of complement would decrease demand, because they're consumed together. An increase in supply would shift supply right, so again, that would be incorrect. Question 10. What would be PED for smartphones if their price fell from US 100 to US 90 quantity demanded rose? So remember the formula first. PED is the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. So the change in the quantity demanded is 50 over 200, which is 25%. The percentage change in price is minus 10, so 10 over 100 equals minus 10%. Put your formula together, 25% divided by minus 10% equals minus 2.5, which will give us here PED of 2.5. Remember, the negative figure is sometimes, it's always negative for PED. Sometimes in the questions they will ignore the negative figure. Doesn't matter, you're looking for the whole number. Question 9 is very straightforward again then, because we've explained this before. For which curve is PES constant? So in other words, which one is it unitary or it will never change? That will be where it comes as a straight line through the point of origin, which in this case is C. And we've explained that before. Just for further relevance, as it moves up here for B, B would be more elastic than D would. And it's to do with the quantity level. Right, so if you take a price level here of, let's call it P, and you move this across, at point B, that is going to have a smaller quantity than it would for D. Just imagine that D moves up there. So therefore, the higher the quantity for D, the smaller the percentage change would be, and that would make it more inelastic. That can be a common question as well, so just be aware. If you have, essentially, if you want to think about it this way, if you have a PES curve that starts on the vertical axis, it's likely to be more elastic than a PES curve that starts on the horizontal axis. Question 8. What would cause a shift in the supply curve? Increase in cost of the product would shift supply left, so that would be wrong. Increase in incomes of consumers would shift demand to the right, not supply. Increase in the demand for a product that is jointly supplied. Okay, so that would. So remember, if you increase the demand of a product that is jointly supplied, what's that's going to do is it's going to cause an extension in supply, right? Now, if they're jointly supplied, the extension in supply means that for the other product, the supply of that product will be able to shift. So here's the extension moving from this equilibrium to here, and then for the product that is jointly supplied, that would result in a shift in the supply curve of that product. Increase in price of product causes extension or contraction, does not cause a shift. Diagram shows world price of coffee in US cents per pound between 1995 and 2005. What event is consistent with the price behavior shown in the time period? Continuous rise in the price of tea. Well, we're not shown anything about that, right? So we can't make that assumption. Entry to the market of new producers of coffee between 1997 and 2001. So that would be consistent with what we're showing, right? Because if there's new suppliers entering into the market, the competition level is increased, and therefore the price should be dropped. A series of good harvests between 2001 and 2005. I wouldn't say necessarily. The price is still only increasing by a small amount. And increased health worries about drinking coffee. We see nothing about the demand for coffee, right? So we can't make those assumptions, and especially here the price of coffee is actually increasing, whereas if we have increasing health worries, demand would shift to the left and the price of coffee would be expected to drop, not to rise. Okay, diagrams show the effect of a change in the market for good X on the market for good Y. What can be concluded? So we can see here for good X, supply is shifted to the left, which has resulted in a contraction in demand. So essentially here demand has gone down, right? And over here demand has increased. Okay, if they're complements, if the demand for X goes down, we would expect the demand for Y to go down as well because they're consumed together. If they're jointly supplied, the supply curves would be affected, not the demand curve. Their substitutes would explain it because of the fact that a contraction in demand here results in a higher level of demand for the other good, and that's because the consumers that switch their demand away from X will now be demanding Y instead. Question 5. What would cause an increase in consumer surplus in the market for a good? So remember, consumer surplus is the area above the equilibrium price to the top of the demand curve. So in this example here, I'll actually bring this up a little bit just to show it to make it easier. So this area in here would be our current consumer surplus. Now what happens, or when consumer surplus increases, is if the demand shifts to the right, because as you can see, the total area of the consumer surplus, which is the black area or the black outline now, would actually be higher. And the same thing happens if we have a shift in the supply curve to the right, because what will happen there is that the price of the product will drop, and therefore the area above equilibrium price to the top of the demand curve will get larger. So increase in supply and increase in demand, they cause increases in consumer surplus. Question 4, which statement is positive? Low inflation is preferable. That's a normative statement. Remember, positive is factual, hypothesis can be tested. Low inflation will provide a more stable macroeconomy. Yeah, we can test that statement, so we can assume it to be positive. Government must intervene in all markets. So again, that's an opinion or a subjective statement that is being made. And government should cut income tax, subjective or opinion-based statement. Okay, question 2. Consumers in country X buy some goods and services from the private sector. Other goods and services are provided by the state. What type of economy is this? Okay, so remember that would be a mixed economy. Joint economy, they're trying to trick you out. Free market is only private. Planned is only the government. And a mixed economy has a mix of public sector and private sector firms, which is what we're told in the question. And last one, question 1. In the diagram, JK is the initial PPC. For an economy producing computers and cars, what would cause the shift for JL? So what we can see is computers stays the same, right? And we have a decrease in our productive capacity for cars. So a fall in output per worker in the car industry, that would explain it, right? Because we would have a decrease in productivity for cars. Fall in the competition in the car industry wouldn't explain it. This is an economy producing computers and cars. Fall in competition in the car industry only, we might expect either no change or we would expect maybe a shift in the other direction. Rise in the potential workforce of the economy would shift the PPC for both outwards. And rise in the price of cars, the price of products is not reflected in the PPC. Okay, and that is October-November 2021, question paper 13 solved.